Welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reed.
And today we're talking about an article that Fiona surfaced to us. We'll get into that a little bit in the episode, but it's just that Google's US ad revenues dropped for the first time in the public history of the company, so 16 years. And we get a little bit off track as we like to do on this read. We talk a little TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, Jeff
Oh,
Bezos. Surprised we didn't say Elon Musk, but you brought up Lee Iacocca, so there's a flyer.
yeah. Well, a little bit is relative, right? For the Digible Dudes, a little bit is probably a lot for everyone else. So bear with us, as
Yeah,
usual.
well, the one thing we didn't cover on the episode, and I know you're ready to go have that queso, but what does this mean for apartments? So quickly, Google's revenue is dropping by 5%. They thought they were going to be up like 13%. Does this mean anything for apartments?
Not in the short term, no. You know, uh, Long term, possibly. And when I say long term, I mean long term. I mean not to poke fun at our own, I guess, industry, but everybody I think appreciates it that's in it is I don't want to say we're last to know or whatever, but like when it comes to, trends, I think even at a macro level, the multifamily industry is behind. And so there's still the movement that's going on to Google right now. I guess that's my point is that transition still hasn't been completed as far as all the money that's being moved from the ILS, advertising into pay-per-click and performance-based models. So for this to change anything like that's just in my opinion not going to happen for a few years.
Yeah, so what you're saying is apartments is going to save Google. The revenue is going to go back up because they're finally migrating over. And apartments is kind of like just discovering Jinko jeans or like the scrunchie for the first time.
Yeah, well, we'll say our clients aren't, hopefully they feel that way, but yeah, it still seems like a lot of the industry is not, yeah, just slow to warm up, I'll say. But um, collectively obviously has a lot of ad power or buying power, more than they really realize because it is so franchise based. But again, like with Google, having Amazon stick it to them kind of in two ways: one, taking more e-commerce, and B, pulling some of their ad spend, then maybe that will incentivize, and this would be the impact that I was talking about. So I should have started there, but that may accelerate the move for Google into ILS territory, which a lot of our advertisers, from what I've heard, are excited about. They're not fearful, they're not unhappy about it. They'd prefer not to have to deal with the segmentation, if you will. It's like, why can't Google just allow us to book straight through their search engine? So if they do that, and then you have that converging with this transition that I was talking about, and it's nearing the completion of it, that could be a 1+1=3 for Google, where it's like, wow, we didn't realize just how much money we might actually absorb by making this move. So
Yeah. Well, based on our estimates of apartment.com, or sorry, of apartments, the industry ad spend each year, they could actually make up the deficit that Google's down. So Google's down to $2 billion effectively. And so it wouldn't, I mean, that might be a third of what apartment spends on advertising. And I get that the ILSs spend a considerable amount of that advertising, but just generally speaking, it wouldn't be crazy. Google launches that for them to make up, you know, a few hundred million, if not a billion, in projections, right? But by people starting to move over. And then you could see very quickly in the next 12 to 24 months that the ILSs increase spend to try to like show their value and to the market. And so there would be a little bit of a, Google wins on both sides. They get new advertisers and then they also get extra spend from the monsters.
yeah, I totally agree. I was going to say, I think that this, instead of them dialing back or, yeah, just cutting their ad spend, I think they're going to get even more competitive because they're going to be under siege, really, from Google. And so, what recourse do they have except to spend more money there to try and continue to keep up their lead volume? So yeah, it's a no brainer to me, and that's why a lot of people, including myself and you, I think, have been scratching our heads why this hasn't happened sooner. But this could be, the straw that broke the camel's back here.
Yeah. Well, that's the intro. You heard it from Reed. This doesn't matter for apartments, so there's no reason to listen to the next half hour. But stay tuned if you just want to hear us jabber. Okay, Reed. So this episode was, I don't want to almost made a joke like sponsored by Fiona, but this is inspired by Fiona, because both this wasn't on either of our radars, this topic, until it came through in a Fiona intro that Google's annual ad sales revenues are expected to decline for the first time effectively ever, as far as we know, but in 16 years since they went public in 2004.
Yeah, caught me off guard for sure. And you expect, with all the retail that's being dialed back, and of course, in particular on the travel, which is in the article, that they would take a hit. But you just feel like they are such a locomotive and have so many other categories that I'll say are going to win, despite the pandemic, that they would somehow offset. And that's been true, right? Because nobody's dealt with this in generations, or a generation, a pandemic. Certainly since Google's been, formed, but you get my drift. Is they've overcome so many situations that you would assume would compromise their ad revenue and potentially have them with an off quarter or off month. But pretty amazing that they've had a 16-year run, and it took COVID to finally stop that streak.
And it's significant too. So they were predicted, according to eMarketer, I think the figure was that they were expected to grow almost 13% this year, but instead they're now projecting to be down 5.3%. So it's really like an 18% swing from what was expected. And what's super, well, a couple interesting points here, but their market share, which I was surprised by, for some reason I didn't remember this figure, but according to eMarketer, their digital ad market share is that they get 31%, almost 32% of every dollar spent on digital ads, and that's going to drop down to 29%. So about 32% down to 29%. So it's not a big jump, but that's still 10%, whatever, off of their taking 3 points off, right? 10% of what they have. And so it's like, well, if they're going to be down in revenue, but they're losing market share, that means the money's going somewhere, right? And so the article says that Amazon, Facebook, Instagram, those other networks are actually expected to pick up and still continue to grow this year.
Yeah, and Amazon, kind of a no-brainer. I mean, God, the amount of money my family spent on Amazon before COVID was startling. Gave me an upside stomach, but now since then, Jesus, it's just crazy. So that was pretty predictable, but the Facebook side of things surprises me, because I feel like a lot of the same industries that are pulling back from that would affect their ad revenue would also affect Facebook. So the fact that they seem to somehow, I guess, be winning through this. That being said, there's a different reason that people are now predicting perhaps a downturn in revenue, and I think that's already starting to be reflected with God, what's the hashtag, David, for don't profit, like don't racism for profit or something. But anyways, several of the biggest brands on Facebook are now boycotting, and they're expecting more to fall in line. But what they also pointed out, and I think this is pertinent for this article or this conversation about Google, is there is no 80-20 rule. A lot of people think that applies to almost everything, and it just doesn't. And so they were saying, while these giant brands on Facebook may cost them, let's just say collectively $1 billion, there's more money for them in their SMBs, so I guess, but yet the SMBs also don't provide 80% of the revenue. So that's a strong business model, obviously, is that they're diversified enough within those tiers of spend. And I just assume that the same was true with Google. But, clearly there's something underneath here that's spelling this 3% drop, like you said.
Right. It's the hit pause on hate. or Stop Hate for Profit, couple
Yeah.
different names, but
Yeah.
where Unilever, Patagonia, some of those are
Right.
have taken a stand. Yeah, that's funny. I didn't even think about that for a second. But just to get back to Google for a minute before we dig in on the rest of the ecosystem, what they're saying, the analysts are saying, is that there's a couple of factors here. One, that Amazon actually pulled their Google budget at the beginning of this year, and they said, sayonara. Well, I don't know if you know about this, Reed, but most people have heard of Amazon, so I guess they feel they don't need that Google ads anymore. And secondly, that when COVID hit, obviously the travel industry, hospitality industry has been crushed. And I forget if it's Travelocity, but I think it is. But the company that owns Travelocity, I'm pretty sure that's the one, is the top advertiser on Google normally year to
That's
year. So if
yeah,
all of a sudden they
that's
pull
it.
out,
Sorry, that's the Expedia group. They own Travelocity.
Mm. Yeah. And so if they pull out and they're your number one customer, and it's not a lot. I feel like I remember it was like they spend like 1% or something of make up like 1% of Google's revenue, but that's one side of it. And maybe you can give some insight here, Reed, because you've obviously run different ad departments that actually handle travel, where there's entire travel teams devoted to. But just generally speaking, I don't know what, compared to other categories when it comes to local advertising, what, if you recall, what a travel split is of the revenue. So, for example, right, if there's a
Yeah.
local metro, how much of revenue might come from travel?
Yeah, well, for us, speaking openly at the Post, without speaking too openly, I guess, it was significant, and a lot of it was because we were in Colorado. So, if you're looking at more of a national agency, I think that's dependent on how vertically based they are versus how general, meaning they'll take just about any client. So, for example, a Razorfish, I couldn't tell you, what that looks like for them versus, more of a regional kind of agency like Ad Taxi was. But certainly there's plenty of money in it, and there's been some, pretty interesting technology and platforms that have recently been built, from travel, like Sojourn, which we, were fortunate enough to get some nice talent from. I'm interested to see, like, as a result of the pandemic, other than just these macro trends of like ad revenue and e-commerce, like what else comes out of it? Because we keep getting asked that about how it's affecting the industry, like our industry, multifamily. And more often than not, we respond by saying it's actually advanced things forward. And that's mainly just because it's forcing people to work in more of a remote capacity and think more virtually and cloud-based and all that other jazz. But for these really giant companies like Google, what will they take out of it? What will they develop as a result? And, for all we know, like, we won't see it again, like I said, tomorrow, but we could see some interesting things surface as a result of this whole crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to your Amazon Facebook for a second, because I wanted to just cover off on Google at first, but then going back to the rest of the ecosystem, that's really interesting. What the point you brought up before about the brands boycotting Facebook. So Amazon, I don't know of any trouble that they're having right now, and it makes sense to me that all of these mom and pops are going to Amazon because it's a turnkey platform to turn on their advertising. So, okay, cool. Yeah, sure. Amazon, let's say it's going to lift up its percentage of ad revenue that it's getting, which was forecasted, I guess, to be almost 13 billion. Significant, but obviously just hits one category. Facebook, so Google's projected to do 39 and a half now, and then Facebook's projected to do 31 billion. So also, let me just say how shocked I am that Facebook's catching up, because for the longest time, I was like, Google, it's almost like, because Google has such market share in search, and because it's an easier way to for attribution with offline attribution, I just always think about Google and intent based, that it's always just on the higher, like that. I just always thought it was so much further in the lead. But if you look at these numbers, I'm doing quick math, but that's like a 20% difference between Google and Facebook on ad revenue generated. And I guess I'm just shocked by that. And what I guess this is moving more to like past, present, so now to future, right? What the heck does that does that mean? Like going ahead, do you think this is like, as you were just saying before we started recording, that Google was the third company now to pass $1 trillion in valuation. Well, even though it's on the way up, do you think, is this a sign of things to come, that it's going to stall out, that it might slide back, and that Facebook, whatever, just starts to take over?
Well, we'll see. And funny enough, Amazon's not in that $1 trillion valuation. So it's Microsoft, Apple, and Google. And so with Microsoft and Apple, they're while there's some ad revenue, that clearly that's not part of that's not the center of their revenue. So for Google it is. And I don't want to sit here and pretend to be a professor in economics and try to explain how or where, all these, like how the chips are going to fall with this kind of stuff. But I did see in that same article that they said Facebook was up to, I think, 675 million as far as their market cap, and that, a lot of people were expecting to get there, but there are privacy entanglements or controversy, and as well as this latest kind of just bad press related to hate crimes and bigots, racists being on there, and then profiting from that, all could compromise the trajectory of Facebook. But I believe, and it says in this article, one of the reasons that Facebook is seeing such an uptick and has still been surging is because their acquisition of Instagram. So that the Instagram platform has really buoyed their ad revenue. I don't know, whether e-com, because that was something I remember. FCom, you probably remember that stretch, where there's a lot of buzz about Facebook commerce. Whether they're seeing any benefit, again, we talk about the winners and losers, like within our own industry, but with these big guys, like where and how is that shaping out, as a lot of them are vying for more the e-commerce dollars. I think Amazon still has a stranglehold on this, and this gets us into the whole like Swiss Army knife. Google's never had a lot of success outside of just their search ad platform. They obviously made a smart strategic move with YouTube, but they haven't been successful with really any products outside of that, relatively speaking, right? And so Amazon's not trying to be Google. They're not trying to be Facebook and connect the world or make information available to anybody and everybody. They are all about one thing, that is in being an e-commerce platform. And yes, I know they're diversifying with their servers and like with Whole Foods and things like that. So hopefully I'm not sounding like a hypocrite and pointing that out. But I just don't know, if it is more about e-com, like that's driving a lot of this, whether, like you said, that trend that Google's seeing is something that's going to continue, where they actually keep sliding back.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way then. If you were to take over one of the companies, would it be Facebook?
Watch out, world. You're saying which one would I take?
Yeah.
Among all those I just listed, or just between Facebook, Google, and Amazon?
Well, I was saying Facebook and Google because they're moving neck and neck, and I'm more of trying to get at your indication on who you think has the greater upside. But now that you're getting to be pick and choose, like, whatever, you want to take Amazon, you let me know.
Well, Amazon, is interesting because of, some of these other sectors. And if I'm speaking strictly from a business standpoint, I would say Amazon, because I think that they've shown to be the most successful with some of these ventures outside of their core platform, but also, again, in a virtual world, and we're certainly seeing it through these times, they're incredibly well positioned. All three, obviously have all sorts of data. Facebook's under most duress, for how they're using it. So I think that's who I'd want to take over. I'd move Bezos aside. I still have a little more hair than him, and see how well I could do with that company. But Google still, I think, probably has, from an ad standpoint, just I have the most trust in them. I see the most longevity. Amazon apparently has done much better, but I don't know those trends yet either. I haven't stayed as close to that, but how they're doing with their ad platform, certainly seeing it more myself when I'm on Amazon, and I know that it's getting more sophisticated. And that was kind of the knock right on Facebook is that when they first came forward with their ad platform, it was such a piece of junk, terrible targeting, like just not much value, but people still knew audience was there. And so they knew they had something to build off of, and then they went too far with it, right? Where they were taking too much advantage of all the data. And it'll be interesting to see whether Amazon learns any lessons from that, because they're just in, frankly, the nascent stages still of their ad platform. But where and how they evolve it, how they utilize data, and if they're able to kind of stay under the radar, so to speak, of like some of the stuff that's hit Facebook.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I can't find an active number for how many advertisers on Google versus Facebook, but Facebook publishes theirs. Their last publish was a year ago, and they had 7 million. Now, Statistica is estimating 8 million. The last time I have Google's numbers is 2015, and they were at 4 million. So I'm sure Google has done better than that since, but it would be really interesting to me to sort of look at how the SMBs have been penetrated, because we know like when, just from our careers in digital, when, as online became more obvious, you had the big brands that were willing to experiment, and they rushed to it. But then over time, these platforms, you mentioned Facebook being sort of nascent previously, they have worked to make it more self-serve and for SMBs. And so they've really started to try to cater towards just like anybody picking up the mouse and getting the campaign launched. And Google for a long time was commended on how easy theirs was. But Facebook more recently, I'll just say anecdotally, I know more people that are willing to attempt running a Facebook campaign or Instagram campaign on their own versus a Google campaign on their own, even with AdWords Express or Google Ads Express. So I wonder why that is. Perhaps it's because it's more of a visual platform, something of that nature. I mean, it's not, as you said, it's not as sophisticated as Google. So, but Google Ads Express really simplifies it almost too much. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, just why?
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go. So I don't have a ton more to add other than I do believe that Facebook is more inviting, even though we as quote unquote experts, or our company, is mostly frustrated still by the platform and the lack of sophistication, integrations, reporting, you name it. It's just not on par with Google. But if I am an SMB, and that's obviously a huge marketplace, I have more confidence in getting on Facebook and getting a campaign off the ground than I do with Google. So you're right about the Data Express or Google Express, whatever. But I still think it intimidates, a lot of these SMBs that just have $500, $1,000. And when you're talking about, hundreds of thousands of SMBs, that adds up, just those small budgets as recurring revenue each month. So I think that's definitely part of it. I'm curious to know, like, where I'll say like a LinkedIn, because you were mentioning categorically where is the most revenue, and there's an enormous amount of digital revenue that's built into recruitment, and how that's affected things. Because when we see these articles, obviously we don't, and we never will, like get to look at the general ledger of each one of them, but and specifically within the ad, for Google, that ad revenue, which categories are winning and losing right now. What's obvious, and it does say in the article, and you can expect, is that travel, they're taking a big hit. And that when they have somebody like Amazon stopping or pausing on their ad budget, then that's also going to be significant. But there's other peripheral, like even with automotive, like, is that, what does that look like quarter over quarter? So those are the things that really, I guess, fascinate me, or would be interesting, like follow up on this whole thing is, what does it look like underneath 30,000 feet?
Well, the LinkedIn was interesting because I knew that Microsoft had just published their most recent quarter earnings, and so they increased 21% year over year in their revenue in the last quarter. Pretty insane. It's funny that they're actually, to your point, not mentioned on that eMarketer article, because in 2019 they were 6.7 billion in revenue. So they're actually not super far behind Amazon. And for being just one, I mean, I'm really surprised being just one social media network that's so much more targeted than like a Facebook that has a conglomerate now of networks. So that's
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah, it is.
Well, back to for a second, let me just say, if I was Google, I would be really ticked off right now. And look, I know they have a culture of happiness and all this, but if I'm them and I'm like, if I'm looking at myself against Facebook, I'd be like, what's with these knuckleheads that are coming up on my rear? Hey, advertisers, like when someone comes to Google, they want to find an answer. I want to find an apartment. Sell me one, right? And you guys are going over to Facebook and running some random ads and you can't track conversions because Google doesn't play nice, or Facebook doesn't play nice with Google Analytics, and you can't really track phone calls reliably. And any metric you look by, it's like, look, we sent this many eyeballs to you, but besides that, good luck. So I would just, because they're hardcore engineers over there at Google, from the logic of it all, it sort of gets me heated a little bit on their behalf, because I would be so ticked off. I'd be like, don't we make much more sense? And by the way, isn't the fact that like Google is lower funnel and Facebook's catching up to it just show, I don't even know how I want to explain this, but it shows like how the market doesn't care as much about, I'll say, the metrics that matter in air quotes, right? Because it's like, again, Google, you can track your form fills, someone converted, they placed a phone call, whatever. And on Facebook, you're throwing money into the into the blue ocean to this random segment called renters that can't get more specific. You don't even know if that renter is willing to have a like look for an apartment right now. So anyways, I'm just
Yeah.
mad.
Well, it does tell you that, both SMBs and, we'll just say Fortune 500 brands still see and are discovering the value of branding, or, the ROI behind branding. And that part, I really applaud. Like, I'm glad to see that. And those dollars often went to broadcast, TV, radio, and newspaper. And now a lot of the branding dollars that were falling there have moved online, and Facebook is just, mopping it all up. But while you can't get the tracking and all that stuff, I mean, what they're basically saying is, and most advertisers and marketers, live by this, but you follow the audience like that, and that's where the ad revenue follows. So that's why Facebook always knew that they were going to have a lot of success at some point. It's just a matter of when, is they built up so much audience, taking kind of that Bezos approach, that a marketer, big or small, would be crazy to not have them as part of their common mix or consideration. And that includes us. We often do incorporate that for that reason. And we have to qualify it and say, you're not going to get the attribution, you're not going to have the sophistication, all this stuff. But what you will have is, you'll have an engaged audience. And the other part of this, David, that I think is important and is a big driver in Facebook's ad revenue is the ad types themselves. Again, Google didn't have much success with those sponsored links. They ran those for a few years and they pulled those back. They still haven't been able to get away from their, where they started, which is, to have, the 3 to 6 paid, paid listings, or whatever, search results, AdWords. But you follow me, right? It's like when somebody says, especially for us, let's use our own industry here for a second, but a lease up, and they're like, hey, we really, need to get off to a good start, with this property. We almost always are like, well, you got to brand it. You got to create some awareness, and you're not going to get that through a text, AdWords campaign. You're going to catch you're going to catch the demand that comes from creating it. So, not trying to, I guess, overstate or ramble on about this, but I think you're getting me. Like, I love the carousel ads, the canvas ads. It's like, I can't do any of that inside of Google. I mean, yes, they have the product listings and they're trying to incorporate more video like into, their platform, and they keep trying to push out new products and things like that, but it's just not the same as an in-feed, ad or an experience. And that's what makes Facebook so powerful.
Yeah. And Google has tried those things before, and they just say they're not as good of an experience. And I think, at least what I've heard, is they don't want to go down what Yahoo did back in the day, just like trying to plaster things all over, because they care about the user experience, which obviously Facebook does too. Facebook cares about the user experience, but yet they've gone that way. So perhaps it's just obviously the difference of someone coming to search versus social. I will say that like it's weird because on some ways, because there's a picture or video or whatever attached to the social ad, it feels more tangible. We already struggle with this already where digital advertising, it's not like a printed mailer or something where it's like, oh, here's something for you. And so I think that helps it versus in Google, it really feels like there's an abyss. Like, oh, my ad went up and what happened with it? Like, I don't trust these keywords because as good as Google is at returning search to me, sometimes I get really frustrated by it where it's like, it's really not returning what I want. But again, like Google, if I'm taking their stance, I'm frustrated because I'm like, you only pay for the clicks you get, bro. So like, what does it matter where it showed up? Only if they click. Facebook doesn't do that. They're like, look, we'll serve your ad and we don't care if nobody wanted to see it. We'll take your monies.
True. I think they're also a bit of a victim of their own success in that they've driven up the cost per click. And you and I have had this debate almost kind of behind the scenes about how much we want to prioritize that within our platform and where and how you should spend your money. But what I'm getting at is if you're at a $13 cost per click, does Google still, make sense versus, let's call it a more diversified or a heavier social budget or whatever. And I obviously took the stance and still do that it has to be part of it. The cost per click, and I think I forget which keyword you said is the most expensive. It's something crazy, but all I'm saying is that over time, if the money keeps getting poured in there, the ROI is bound to start to go the wrong way. And so that can be another thing that brands have just started to take notice of, or even SMBs. It's just got so crowded, so saturated that the ROI is not delivering what they, I guess, got accustomed to. And so they're more open to exploration or shifting budget to some of these other mega platforms.
Well, let me throw this to you. It's just a fun thing, but we have recently been doing quite a bit with TikTok. Do you want to take a gander at what, or a guess at what their revenues are?
Well, I mean, they just did the press release about the self-serve platform being available like as of 2 weeks ago, and they're just building out their agency partnership. So I'm going to say it's a drop in the bucket. I will say, geez, oh my God. 50 million a month, that's peanuts, but that's what I'll throw out there.
Well, in Q1, they did more than 5 billion.
You're kidding me. In their ad revenue?
Yeah. Last year they did 17.
That's unreal. Is that must be coming, is that like Alibaba or something? Is that coming? That can't be stateside. I wonder what that looks like from a geographic,
Yeah, I tried to find that. I found iOS stats, but I couldn't find just like US only. Because to your point, like they have almost zero presence when it comes to US ad sales. So now all of a sudden it makes sense to me where it's like everyone talks TikTok. They come over here and I'm like, well, and look, I know we're having conversations with many customers about it, but in my mind, I'm like, is this thing going to stick around? Like, I know they're getting these crazy valuations, but is it just the flavor of the month? And then it's like, well, why the hell are you taking so long to get your ads up? And you and I talked about this, I don't think on the podcast, but we were talking about the similarities with Instagram versus Snapchat and now TikTok and how they're following a similar model where they're like, yeah, build the audience and later we'll monetize. But doing 17 billion last year tells me they have effing monetized, but it's just not in the US. It goes back to the power of China and India, right? And now it's like, no wonder you're so damn slow to get over here with your ads because you're like, all right, these cheesy Americans, like they're a lot of work. And guess what? We're already crushing back to our Amazon numbers. They're crushing LinkedIn. Hell, at that point, they're basically like almost half of Facebook.
Yeah.
In fact, they are half of Facebook.
Yeah, that's crazy. I had no idea, obviously, but the number I put out was more US based. So I'd be curious to know what that looks like and then what their projections are. Obviously, we also talked about the biggest threat to TikTok here is political. And that may not be I guess, reserved just for the States. I mean, there's plenty of countries now that are kind of banding together against Chinese-based or headquartered companies. So we'll see how that shakes out. But for now, we'll experiment like so many others with the platform and see what comes back. I thought it was fun today, like on the call. I think there is some really great opportunities for multifamily, and obviously we should have a follow-up podcast on TikTok because we could take that a lot of directions. So I know this is more about Google.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I just haven't been into these revenue numbers on these platforms in a while because I've been so. And this is you and I have talked about this, but it's like we used to touch all these other categories, so I was just more aware of this stuff because I needed to be more abreast. But as we move deeper into apartments, we have to be careful to still stay in tune with what's happening with the wider ecosystem. Because well, first of all, it's like, are these TikTok numbers legit? Because it's a private company, right? And venture capital likes to make themselves look big. And I know there's all that funkiness with China. So perhaps they're just running a little bit of projections on us.
Yeah.
But
yeah. There's a small misprint. It was yen, not dollars, David.
yeah, totally. Totally. But I'll just say back to the finishing this off, wrapping it up with Google. It's crazy, like you said, that this is the run that they're on, like more than 16 years, and now they're finally taking a hit. And I wonder if in a way this will be a nice disruption for them. I mean, it's not like they're hurting, obviously. But if this will be a disruption for them where they'll say, like, shoot, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't be as focused on like these giant advertisers as we are. They're super top heavy there, and we know from being a premier partner that they've really pulled back on their channel partnerships and their support of let's just say agencies and of course SMBs, because the joke is you can't get them on the phone. And I guess the positive spin on this could be maybe this would be the shakeup they need to decide, you know what, there is value in just working on that smaller ecosystem, because all of those smaller dollars, they add up. They're sure they're a pain, but if you can get it worked, you're incredibly stabilized.
Yeah. Well, it would seem, again, because of not just, the times, like meaning, what's happened as a result of COVID, but also just thinking about the future, that they should be shifting more of their attention away from, funny enough, their bread and butter. So that's the counter argument, but that they should be, and we know that they are focused more on their servers, like their cloud-based platform, and they're trying to disrupt, or not dethrone, but just get really aggressive there so that Amazon doesn't run away with it. And then same thing on the e-commerce. And the good thing for them is that all these searches no different than the ILS, although I take that back. That's an interesting one too. Like I'd be curious to know how many people are going straight into Amazon versus starting with Google, because we've talked about that a lot. Obviously with ILS, 90% of the traffic originates from Google. I wonder what that trend looks like or has, and naturally it's gonna look very different with Amazon pulling back on their ad spend. A lot more of those searches are going to be native.
Yeah, I used to know that figure. In fact, this is the beauty of Prime, as you were just talking about. But my search behavior used to be always go to Google first, and then I would look for like the best deal. And then over time, as I've been a Prime customer for over a decade, my behaviors go straight to Amazon. And in fact, I get ticked off if I can't find it on Amazon. Right now, I'm trying to buy an evaporative cooler for the cabin because it's hot as hell, and we don't have an air conditioner. And it's like we just need swamp cooler basically, and Amazon's like out of stock. So I'm having to go through Google to try to find it, and I'm so ticked off at the experience there. They don't have. And you know me, I bitch constantly about Amazon's UI UX. I know people like herald it for being so great. I think it's kind of trash. They can do such a better job with that experience, but they don't have to because they're crushing it. And back to Google though, when I do e-commerce on there, I'm like, this sucks, man. And I don't trust the results. I know that a lot of the Amazon results are their advertisements in the way that they do it, but which of course Google is. But for some reason, this is just my own study of one, but when I go to Google and I try to search through their e-com, like Frugal platform or whatever, it doesn't it's like, oh, well, I know the first 2 pages are advertisements, so there's no organic listings. And that really, bothers me because it's like, well, I don't know that the best deal or quickest shipment or whatever is going to be related there. And I think my behavior for the Amazon back, like just like your family, I go there because I know I can get the shipping's gonna be fast. It's not gonna be delayed. I'll have it in a couple days. Versus the Google route, it's like usually, and I just did this before this chat, but it was like usually ships within 2 weeks. I'm like, well, get the hell out of here. Like, I'll drive to New Mexico. I don't know. Tell me where it is.
Yeah. Well, speaks to that moat that we talk about for our own company, but certainly, we're just following the footsteps of a lot larger companies that have heavily prioritized their own moats. And so Amazon has done that, meaning like they're so far ahead, right, on the e-commerce platform, e-commerce game. And a lot of that is not the UI UX. It's everything else that happens to make Amazon, the preferred choice. And that's what Google is, I'm sure, learning the hard way, is that they just don't have the infrastructure built out for that. But lots of other people, of course, have tried to keep up or find ways to crack Google's armor on the search and ad platform, and they haven't been able to do it. So just you don't like to think like, well, then is it hopeless? Like, are we never going to get a better user experience from Amazon? Are we never going to see a different ad platform really like enter the picture? And it's hard to say. Speaking of good to great, they point to a lot of those companies that have been around for, I think that was part of the criteria, is they had to have been around for like at least 60 years or something, so that they had these really long like comparisons where they could say like when they were in the good state, like that had to be a minimum of at least 15 years, I think it was. And Google's starting to get older, Amazon's starting to get older, but yeah, it's fun, I guess, to speculate, think about, our kids, like that generation. Will they be the ones to finally see these giants disrupted?
Mm-hmm.
Will there be a Polaroid or a GE, like and those aren't fair to group together, but just where there's a huge shakeup.
Yeah, well, you got to imagine, right? Because as you said, like I think they're both founded in like 96 and 98. And that, for the Good to Great book, that wouldn't have qualified because they just don't even have the longevity before, but also after. And that's why I was curious about this downturn to say, is this going to be sort of the turning point to take a company from, great to no longer great? Like, do they have the lasting power? And I know obviously Bezos talks a lot about that, but it's because he's one of the few still founding like leaders. I mean, you have Zuckerberg doing that too, where he's a founder, CEO, but and both of them seem very apt for the long term. The Google guys seem to be like, you know what, it's a quality of life thing. I want to go off and play with self-driving cars or whatever. And instead you have like Bezos, it's like, I'll play with rocket ships, but I ain't leaving this thing because I'm doing it for the long haul. So I don't know, just really interesting to see how that evolves over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And in also that book, they said that while leadership certainly is a big part of any company's success, that they didn't find the great companies to be all about one, like a Zuckerberg or a Bezos. And so question is how much value is there in that model, if you will? Certainly there's personal protections, which I just read about with Zuckerberg, just obviously still having the majority and the super voting rights and all that stuff. Nobody's moving that guy out. He's always going to have the final say. And is that a good thing for Facebook? Is that a good thing for their long-term future? And you read that book by Jim Collins and he would tell you, no, that's not good. That's a Lee Iacocca model. So we'll see how that goes for the two of them. Bezos seems to me inherently more innovative and more of a risk taker for the good, and he's shown that. So he's just kind of the unicorn within the unicorn. But we'll see. All good stuff. I'm getting I'm getting hangry.
Yeah, go have your fourth round of chips.
That's right. Oh man.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up.